The audience expected another light-hearted interview. But when Jimmy Kimmel accuses Harrison Ford of covering up a bizarre scandal involving a missing Hollywood producer and a remote desert airstrip, the tension escalates into a fiery clash that stuns viewers and spirals out of control. The studio lights flared, the band played its usual upbeat tune, and the crowd clapped with robotic enthusiasm. It was supposed to be a regular night on Jimmy Kimmel Live, the kind of evening where nostalgia met banter, and the audience got their dose of harmless celebrity charm. Harrison Ford, stoic and sharp at 82, took the guest chair with the kind of quiet authority that only comes from surviving 6 decades in Hollywood. But what no one expected, least of all Ford, was the ambush waiting beneath Jimmy's usual smirk. From the start, something felt off. Jimmy opened with the typical warm-up chatter, reminiscing about Ford's legacy, poking fun at his gruffness, tossing in a few Indiana Jones jabs. But there was a noticeable edge, an impatience in Jimmy's tone, a subtle antagonism cloaked in humor. Ford, polite but stiff, played along at first. The audience chuckled. The cues were hit. Everything seemed fine. Then came the shift. Out of nowhere, Jimmy pivoted. He leaned in with mock sincerity, brows furrowed, voice lowered just enough to feign concern. And then he dropped it. The accusation. A Hollywood producer, Quentin Nash, had vanished a decade ago under mysterious circumstances. No body, no trail. Just gone. But according to Jimmy, new evidence had surfaced, linking Nash's last known whereabouts to a private airstrip in the Mojave Desert. An airstrip Harrison Ford had reportedly landed at multiple times without filing flight plans. The studio fell into an unnatural silence. The audience didn't laugh. They weren't sure if it was a joke. Ford didn't speak. His eyes narrowed, just barely, but the atmosphere snapped tight like a piano wire. Jimmy kept going. He didn't just imply suspicion. He insinuated that Ford was part of a cover-up, even going so far as to flash a grainy satellite image of a plane eerily resembling Ford's vintage aircraft, parked beside a beat-up warehouse. Jimmy, now visibly enjoying the discomfort, added layers. An off-grid cabin Ford had been building in secret. A list of strange communications logged on aviation forums, and even a theory involving smuggled artifacts. Harrison's jaw flexed, his body stilled, unmoving as the laughter track faltered and then failed altogether. There was no attempt at levity now, just the raw glare of a man pushed too far. He responded with sharp precision, his voice like gravel on steel, slicing through the air without theatrics. He didn't raise it, didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word landed like a gavel. He made it clear, not only was Jimmy's claim a fabrication, but dragging in a decades-old disappearance as some sort of stunt was grotesque. The airstrip, he said, was used for routine test flights, cleared through proper channels. And the so-called cabin? A rehab center for veterans, not that Jimmy had bothered to look. The energy shifted again, but not in Jimmy's favor. Ford didn't just defend himself. He flipped the script. He started poking holes in Jimmy's sources, revealing how one of the aviation forums was run by a known conspiracy blogger who once claimed to have been abducted by aliens. He cited specific dates, flight logs, and tower communications. He even named the veteran whose testimony could corroborate his story, one who had served 3 tours overseas, and credited Ford with helping him recover from severe PTSD. But Harrison wasn't done. He dug deeper, exposing the hypocrisy. How Jimmy, just last year, had donated to the very foundation that managed the airstrip. How his research team must have known, or worse, intentionally omitted, that fact. The crowd's unease turned into a silent shockwave. The smug grin on Jimmy's face cracked. Still, he tried to save face. He attempted to joke it off, tried to steer back into safer territory, but Ford didn't let him. The gloves were off now, Ford brought up a recent scandal Jimmy had barely dodged, a backstage meltdown involving a young staffer, swept under the rug by the network. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. The blood drained from Jimmy's face. What began as a calculated ambush had turned into a televised reckoning. And the worst part? The cameras were still rolling. The control room debated cutting to commercial. The producer motioned frantically from the wings. But Jimmy waved them off, too deep into the pit he'd dug to climb out now. He tried to deflect, accused Ford of overreacting, of being paranoid. But the studio audience was no longer on his side. Murmurs rippled through the rows. The mood had curdled. Harrison leaned back, arms crossed, not smug, but resolute. He wasn't here to play the Hollywood game tonight. And whatever illusion of control Jimmy thought he had, it had evaporated the moment he crossed the line. Then, Ford's final blow landed. He reached beneath his chair, pulled out a worn folder, and calmly slid it across the desk. Jimmy hesitated. Inside were pages, flight logs, notarized statements, drone footage from the airstrip, timestamps, and a signed letter from the Federal Aviation Administration verifying Ford's activities. Every accusation Jimmy had tossed was dismantled in hard ink. The host stared at the papers, stunned, the silence heavier than any monologue. And that's when Harrison Ford stood. Without a word, he adjusted his jacket, looked Jimmy dead in the eyes, and walked off the stage. Not rushed, not emotional. Just finished. The audience was frozen, not clapping, not cheering, just watching history combust in real time. But the question hung in the air, pulsing with the tension of everything left unsaid. What the hell just happened? The words echoed in every corner of the studio, from the shocked audience sitting stiffly in their seats to the control room where a dozen producers scrambled to make sense of the chaos that had just unfolded. Harrison Ford, Hollywood icon, industry legend, had just walked off Jimmy Kimmel Live in one of the most blistering on-air confrontations ever witnessed. No commercial break, no post-interview rap, no rehearsed reconciliation, just silence. Backstage, security was tense but unsure. No one wanted to step in and say the wrong thing. Not to Harrison, not to Jimmy. Ford moved past the curtains with cold precision, barely acknowledging anyone. His team trailed behind him, frantic, phones already lighting up with calls from publicists, journalists, and agents. But Harrison didn't break stride. He was gone before the doors even closed behind him. On stage, Jimmy sat frozen. He tried for a smirk, some kind of off-the-cuff line to pull the crowd back, but the weight in the room had shifted too violently. There was no pivoting. The crowd didn't bite. They were waiting for an explanation, or at least an acknowledgement, that something truly seismic had just taken place. Instead, Jimmy shifted in his chair, muttered a half-hearted joke about needing a drink, and awkwardly cut to commercial. The applause sign blinked, but barely half the crowd clapped. The damage was done. But the night wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As cameras went dark and the crew began to debrief, panic rippled through the network. Executives were already on the phone. What was that segment? Was it scripted? Who approved those images? Why hadn't legal flagged it? And most importantly, why had Jimmy gone completely off-book? Behind closed doors, producers reviewed the footage. Every second was scrutinized. And slowly, the reality became clear. Jimmy had planned this ambush. He'd had the images loaded, the accusation rehearsed, but no one knew just how far he'd push it, or how badly it would backfire. That was when one of the assistant producers, younger, newer, less filtered, finally said what everyone else was thinking. This wasn't just a stunt. Jimmy wanted to humiliate him. The room went silent, because deep down it made sense. The rumor had always been there, low-key whispers in entertainment circles, that Jimmy held a quiet grudge against Ford. Some traced it back to a charity poker game a decade earlier, where Ford allegedly called Jimmy out in front of a room full of A-listers for disrespecting the service staff. Others believed it stemmed from something even pettier. A canceled film project Jimmy's cousin had been producing, torpedoed after Ford publicly passed on it and called the script unwatchable. Whatever the origin, tonight proved the grudge was real, and now it was public. Within the hour, clips from the show had exploded across social media. Harrison Ford destroys Jimmy Kimmel live on air was trending worldwide. Fan edits with dramatic music, slow motion, and side-by-side comparisons of Ford's cool rage versus Jimmy's unraveling were everywhere. Memes poured in. Hashtags formed. Celebrities started tweeting cryptic reactions. Even other late-night hosts chimed in, thinly veiled comments about keeping interviews classy that only stoked the fire. Back at the studio, Jimmy finally retreated to his dressing room, locking the door behind him. Inside, the bravado dropped. His hands trembled slightly as he poured himself a drink. Neat, no ice. His phone buzzed non-stop. He ignored most of it. The network, his agent, the executive producer. But one message caught his eye. It was from a private number. Just 5 words, "You just lost the room." No name, no signature. But Jimmy knew exactly who it was from. The letter folder Ford had left behind now sat on Jimmy's desk. He hadn't touched it since the moment it was slid across the stage. It sat there like a loaded weapon, unopened, undeniable. His ego screamed to toss it in the trash, but the silence was too loud, the humiliation too fresh. He opened it. What he saw gutted him. Everything Ford had claimed was there. Not just documents, not just names, but footage, interviews. A handwritten note from the veteran Ford had helped, describing how the secluded desert facility, what Jimmy had mocked as a shady retreat, had become a lifeline for dozens of soldiers forgotten by the system. And there, in one of the included clips, was Ford himself, hauling lumber, helping rebuild the clinic, away from cameras, away from fame. The weight of it crashed down. Jimmy had taken a swing at a man who wasn't hiding from scandal, but from celebrity. And in doing so, he'd revealed far more about himself than Ford. The damage was irreversible. But then came the knock, soft, unassuming. A producer's voice on the other side, tentative. There was a problem. Ford hadn't just left the show, he'd gone live. Not on a talk show, not through a publicist, but on his own terms. A live stream, quietly launched from a private foundation's account, was now broadcasting Ford, speaking directly to the public. No agents, no networks, just Harrison Ford in front of a crackling fire, raw, resolute. Jimmy opened a browser. There. It was already at 500,000 viewers and rising by the second. Ford wasn't ranting. He wasn't attacking. He was just speaking. He talked about legacy, about truth, about how power in the wrong hands, even in comedy, can corrode. He didn't name Jimmy. He didn't have to. The world already knew. And then, the moment that struck the final blow. Ford held up a photo. It was old, creased at the edges. It showed him standing beside Quentin Nash, the missing producer Jimmy had accused him of being involved with, alive, and well, arm in arm, smiling in front of a completed rehab facility. The internet exploded. Jimmy dropped his phone. Because Quentin Nash hadn't vanished. He had walked away. From Hollywood. From all of it. And now, the only person left holding the torch of scandal was Jimmy Kimmel himself. But there was still one unanswered question, pulsing just beneath the surface. If Nash was alive, why did Jimmy say he wasn't? That question burned through the internet, like wildfire, igniting every entertainment blog, talk show, and podcast within hours. Viewers weren't just captivated anymore, They were enraged. Accusing Harrison Ford of complicity in a mysterious disappearance was one thing. But making that claim while knowing Quentin Nash was alive, that was something else entirely. And yet, it was true. Within a day of Harrison Ford's impromptu live stream, the truth had unraveled in a storm of headlines. Nash, the once reclusive producer, had released a written statement confirming everything Ford had said. He'd left Hollywood by choice over a decade ago, burned out by a toxic industry that chewed people up and turned pain into content. The airstrip was real, the facility was real, and so was the work Ford had done. Nash had gone off the grid because the industry nearly destroyed him. He hadn't vanished. He'd escaped, and Jimmy Kimmel had known that. In a bombshell leak, a whistleblower from within Jimmy's own research team came forward with emails. Emails showing Jimmy had received confirmation from Nash's legal representative just 2 weeks earlier. Nash was not only alive, but had explicitly declined to appear on Jimmy Kimmel Live or be referenced in any content associated with the show. That alone should have ended any segment involving his name. But Jimmy had forged ahead. Why? The answer came faster than anyone expected, and not from Jimmy, but from someone even closer to the storm. It was a Tuesday afternoon when a video surfaced. Not a leak, not a paparazzi clip. This one was deliberate. Shot from inside a dimly lit room, a man sat across from the camera with a weary look in his eyes. It was Rick Dalton, a former producer for Jimmy Kimmel Live, recently let go after 15 years on staff. His departure had been quiet. No drama, no statement. Until now. In the video, Rick laid everything bare. The segment with Harrison Ford had been Jimmy's personal vendetta, born from years of resentment, rooted in a bruised ego and a desperate hunger to stay relevant. According to Rick, Jimmy's influence had begun to wane in the last 2 years. Ratings were slipping, the audience was shifting, and Ford, who'd always remained untouchable, represented everything Jimmy couldn't control. Rick confirmed the poker game story. Ford had, in front of over a dozen celebrities, called Jimmy out for mocking a waitress at the event. Jimmy had laughed it off, but everyone saw the sting behind his eyes. That wound never healed. What was worse, Rick revealed, was that Quentin Nash had once offered Jimmy's cousin a chance to co-produce an indie film, a film that Ford had passed on with brutal honesty. That project never got picked up, and Jimmy blamed Ford for killing it. So when Jimmy found out Nash was still alive, still in quiet contact with Ford, he saw an opportunity. Not for ratings, but for revenge. He crafted a narrative, twisted half-truths, and weaponized his platform under the guise of comedy. It was never meant to be a joke. It was meant to ruin Ford's reputation. Jimmy had calculated that the weight of an on-air accusation would overwhelm the aging actor into either silence or stumbling defensiveness. He miscalculated. Rick's testimony hit like a freight train. The media devoured it, and public opinion shifted sharply. Former colleagues of Jimmy's began sharing their own stories, tales of control, manipulation, and manufactured conflicts staged for viral moments. It was like pulling a thread from a jacket, only to realize the whole thing was coming apart. Sponsors began backing out. Affiliates started pulling reruns. And the network? They stayed silent for 3 days, an eternity in broadcast time. Then came the statement Jimmy Kimmel would be taking an indefinite leave of absence from Jimmy Kimmel Live, effective immediately. The show would air reruns while the network reassessed the future of the late-night franchise. Translation: the empire had fallen. Jimmy's final appearance, his disastrous interview with Ford, was scrubbed from the official channel. But it lived on through clips, re-uploads, and endless commentary. It was studied, analyzed, even dissected in journalism classes as an example of when entertainment crosses the line into character assassination. Meanwhile, Harrison Ford said nothing. No press tours, no statements, no follow-ups. He went back to his life, back to the quiet work he'd been doing long before Jimmy tried to drag him into a scandal. The Mojave retreat expanded. Veteran outreach tripled. Donations poured in from all over the world. For once, Ford became the subject of public admiration not for his roles, but for his integrity. And then, 1 month later, Quentin Nash made his first public appearance in over 10 years. He didn't go on a talk show. He didn't sit for a podcast. He walked on stage at a small veterans fundraiser in Santa Clarita, where Harrison Ford introduced him with a single sentence. Some people leave the spotlight to survive. Some stay in the dark to build something better. The two embraced, and the crowd stood in thunderous applause, not for fame, but for the truth finally catching up to the lie. In the weeks that followed, a new story began to unfold. Not one of scandal, but of reclamation. The late-night landscape started to shift. Audiences demanded more transparency, more accountability. Other hosts took notice. The format that once relied on cheap shots and sensationalism began to pivot. Slowly, but unmistakably, toward something real. And Jimmy. He disappeared from the public eye. Rumors floated. A retreat overseas, a possible podcast rebrand, even a book deal. But none of it stuck. The world had moved on, not with malice, but with clarity. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't canceled. He was understood, and that understanding left little room for the kind of celebrity he had built himself to be. No redemption arc, no surprise return, just silence, which for once felt like the most honest ending he could offer. As for Harrison Ford, he remained what he'd always been: private, principled, untouchable in the ways that mattered. When asked about the incident months later, he simply shook his head and said, "That part of the story's over." And it was. The stage was empty. The lights dimmed, but the message remained. In a world obsessed with spectacle, sometimes the quietest truth is the loudest thing you'll ever hear.